Thank you for joining us for Racism, Discrimination, and the Wealth Gap. I am pleased to introduce our speaker, Ms. Rochelle Riley. Ms. Riley is the Director of Arts and Culture for the City of Detroit, and for 19 years, from the year 2000 through 2019, she was a nationally syndicated columnist for the Detroit Free Press. Her columns were part of the entry that won the 2009 Pulitzer Prize for Local Reporting. Ms. Riley has appeared on NPR, MSNBC, CNN, and Fox, and she has worked as an editor or reporter at the Washington Post, the Dallas Morning News, the Dallas Times Herald, and the Louisville Courier-Journal. She was inducted into the Michigan Journalism Hall of Fame in 2016 and the North Carolina Media and Journalism Hall of Fame in 2019. Ms. Riley is also notable for her work in mentoring future journalists to ensure that newsrooms reflect the diversity of their communities. This is what led to her being awarded the Ida B. Wells Award for the National Association of Black Journalists in Northwestern University. Ms. Riley's book, The Burden: African Americans and the Enduring Impact of Slavery, explores the still very present impacts on African Americans of not just slavery, but also post-slavery discrimination. For example, Jim Crow, redlining, unequal access to education, exclusion from the labor force, and predatory lending, to name a few. This very intentional discrimination has cut off African Americans from the opportunity to accumulate wealth, which is evident in statistics regarding the wealth gap in our country, and also ever so present in the context of our estate planning practices. Ms. Riley is going to explore these issues with us, and we are thrilled to have her join us. With that, welcome, Ms. Riley, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very, very much, Stephanie, and thanks to the American College of Trust and Estate Counselors. I'm thrilled to be here. I spent the past almost 20 years being the media, and now I get to be author and commentator and fierce Twitterer. But today I'm going to talk to you about some very serious issues that I'm thrilled that you want to hear about. So I'm glad you see my face, because for a little bit you're going to be watching this PowerPoint. We're going to talk about systemic racism and its impact on wealth inequalities between Blacks and whites. Or, why did Aretha Franklin die without a single valid will? She left behind a partner, children, grandchildren, friends, and a legion of fans. However, she did not leave a will. Well, actually, several wills were eventually found, including one in a couch. It was a subject of great gossip, numerous news stories, and heartbreaking fights among family members, and even a court battle. But it came as little surprise to many Black folks because it is not uncommon. Only 32% of African Americans have wills. Prince didn't leave a will. That's right. Neither did Michael Jackson, even though he's still making more money than many people will make in their lifetimes. Neither did James Brown, Jimi Hendrix, Bob Marley, or I already mentioned Michael Jackson, but I can tell you, even though he's not Black, he did give us the Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln also died without a will. Now, why? Why would this be something that has been a problem literally systemically for centuries and is still a problem in the 21st century? Let's start with my personal history with finances. It may surprise some of you, since I learned to read when I was 3, was raised by an English teacher and a chemistry professor, attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I now sit on the Journalism School's Foundation board, and make pretty good money as a newspaper columnist and now as a mayoral appointee. But I didn't know what a 401k was until I was in my 4th newspaper job. I didn't start saving money until my 5th job. I grew up in a tiny town in North Carolina. It's in eastern North Carolina, and it's so tiny that some maps will mention the historic Walston Bullock house, but not my town, unless you zoom way in to find Tarboro. My parents divorced when I was little, and my father, the professor, remained in New York where we lived, and my mother, who had been stricken with multiple sclerosis, returned home to her Southern childhood home where my grandparents raised us. My grandfather worked in a mill, then drove a cab and cleaned offices, all to make sure that his grandchildren went to college. My grandmother's full-time job was us. It was not until I joined the Washington Post in 1987, the day that Ed Meese announced the Iran-Contra investigation, did I learn about unions and savings and retirements. Of course, I left before I became vested, but at least I knew what all those old people were talking about. I didn't have a will until 1992 when I adopted a little girl when I was an executive at the newspaper in Louisville, Kentucky. I was vested in the pension plan, saving for college, and becoming what most folks would consider being a responsible citizen. But it was more important for me to own a house. It is what everyone in our neighborhood learned. It is what everyone in our family learned. It is what people in many Black families learned. That was the sign of wealth that we learned. There was no discussion of enduring wealth or ensuring wealth for another generation, establishing order post-death. In my entire life, we treated talk of death like talk of sex. It was verboten unless absolutely necessary. And the sex talk did become necessary, the death talk not. Black people don't spend a lot of time talking about wealth because most do not have it. And when the discussion turns to finding ways to decrease the wealth gap, there are inevitable complaints as people point to Oprah Winfrey and Will Smith as Black Americans who didn't need any help. That's like saying every white American is Donald Trump or Bill and Melinda Gates, and they should all be successful. Now I want us to revisit a little African American history. Yes, we're going to go there to the 1619 Project that was done by the New York Times. There would be no America without my ancestors and those of millions of people whose skin is the color of mine. Yet the mere reminder of this caused such a stir when my friend Nicole Hannah-Jones wrote about it that historians clinging to the myth came out of the woodwork to criticize the project. But the lesson is true. America was built by free Black labor, stolen from other countries and brought here to be the economic engine that built white wealth and built a strong country. That is the lesson every Black child in America should have grown up learning for the past 400 years. That is the lesson every American child should have grown up learning for the past 400 years. Without that free labor that built this country, our tiny country in its bold infancy would have had to have spent eventually billions of dollars in today's dollars and would not have generated massive wealth for part of the country. Consider this. The argument has become, although it was never an argument, when did America begin? When it was founded in 1619 and began using free imported labor to build the greatest country in the world? Or when it was made official in 1776 by the signatures of well-meaning slave owners and others seeking freedom? Yes, freedom from British tyranny. The irony is staggering. The Center for Automotive Research does forecasts so that they can let you know how much you should be paying workers. The expected increases for Fiat Chrysler, GM, and Ford are still big three in Detroit. Will add between $800 million and $1 billion to the balance sheets of these automakers by 2023. That's based on the number of workers in each company. That's roughly 133,000 workers total. Almost $1 billion for 133,000 workers. Building wealth for white people. So what if Black people had been paid, not just when we worked for free, but when we worked for less for centuries after? Remember that enslaved African Americans were not allowed to read. It was illegal to teach. African Americans were not given property or homes or money after being emancipated. Some could not leave the plantations they were living in because they were the only homes they knew. Others gladly left, but were subsequently arrested falsely in a heinous trend that exists today and given a choice between jail or returning to the plantation. And sadly, the Emancipation Proclamation freed very few slaves. It was the death knell for slavery and led to the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which formally abolished slavery. But slavery continued. African Americans fled north only to be re-enslaved. I didn't learn until 2 years ago that slavery still existed in Detroit, where literally runaways would come right here, get to this side of the river, see freedom on the other side and not be able to make it. It broke my heart to learn about it. It broke my heart to think about it. So African Americans have had to fight not just for recognition of their contribution to the building of America, but for the right to participate in America, to vote, to have equal access to housing, transportation, and education. And attempts to build wealth were met with fierce racist opposition, even death. Following World War I, Tulsa, Oklahoma was recognized nationally for its affluent African American community known as the Greenwood District. This thriving business district and surrounding residential area was referred to as the Black Wall Street. But in 1921, nearly the entire Greenwood area was destroyed by hate. On May 30th, 1921, a young Black man named Dick Rowland was riding in the elevator in the Drexel building with a white woman named Sarah Page. The details of what followed varied person to person. Accounts circulated among the city's white community during the day and became more exaggerated with each telling. Tulsa police arrested Rowland, and they began an investigation. And an inflammatory report in the May 31st edition of the Tulsa Tribune spurred a confrontation between white and Black armed mobs. Shots were fired, and the outnumbered African Americans began retreating to the Greenwood District, where they thought they would be safe. But in the early morning hours of June 1st, 1921, Greenwood was looted and burned to the ground by white rioters. The governor declared martial law, and National Guard troops arrived in Tulsa, and they assisted firemen in putting out fires, but they took all the African Americans into custody to keep them out of the hands of vigilantes. And they imprisoned all Black Tulsans not already interned. Over 6,000 people were held at the convention hall and fairgrounds, some for as long as 8 days. 24 hours after the violence erupted, it stopped. But in the wake of that violence, 35 city blocks lay in charred ruins. More than 800 people were treated for injuries, and people initially reported as 36, but historians now believe were as many as 300, died. It is now called the Tulsa Race Massacre, and it's important to understand the complexity of the times. Jim Crow, jealousy, white supremacy, and land lust all played roles in that destruction. Historically, it has been called the Tulsa Race Riot for insurance purposes. Designating it as a riot prevented insurance companies from having to pay benefits to the people of Greenwood whose homes and businesses were destroyed. It also was common at the time for any large-scale clash between different racial or ethnic groups to be characterized as a race riot. That is still true. But the Tulsa Massacre and other less deadly incidents have been held up for decades as examples of what happens to Black people when they try to build wealth, when they don't stay in their lane, don't stay in their place. Thus, 246 years of official free labor ended for the most part, but it did not end for all African Americans, and attempts to build wealth, thus having wealth to bequeath, has been hard. Couple history with the American government ensuring for decades that schools for Black children were substandard to those for white children, that Black people could not get jobs that paid as much as those for white people, and a system of near indentured servitude that exists to this day became real life for so many people. You can hear that toll that it takes in this excerpt from my book, The Burden. The scene is seared into my memory. Red, just paroled from Shawshank Prison, works as a bag boy at a local grocer. He quickly packs a sack for a customer, then raises his hand to catch the manager's attention. Restroom break, boss? His white supervisor calls him over. You don't need to ask me every time you need to take a piss. Just go, understand? Red nods quickly, acquiescently. He goes to the men's room. As he stands over the urinal, his words in voiceover hang in the air. 40 years I've been asking permission to piss. I can't squeeze a drop without say-so. That is what prison did to a grown man in a fictional film, The Shawshank Redemption. That is what being enslaved did to a people. There are thousands of examples in written history that detail the physical brutality of slavery. But what America must pay more attention to is the emotional brutality that boils down to a single word: permission. Permission to speak, permission to vote, permission to work in jobs that allow us to use all of our talents, permission to drink from community water fountains, permission to dine at public lunch counters, permission to sit anywhere on public buses that our tax dollars fund, permission to provide our children with educations equal to those of their white peers, permission to embrace the freedom the Emancipation Proclamation lied about, permission to run for the presidency of the United States of America. We African Americans in America have spent a century and a half, seeking permission, hiding our lights under bushels, accepting less than we deserve because we've been trained to believe we don't deserve more. It is time to put that burden down. So where do we go from here? We have to talk about slavery because that literally fuels everything that came after. It is literally the reason why we can't focus and fix many of our economic problems, because we don't see one connected to the other, like some people don't see COVID connected to the economy. I'll give you an example. For more than 2 decades as a newspaper columnist, every time I wrote a positive, life-affirming column about the success of a Black person, I expected the email, the letter, or the phone call, and it always came. "Why do you write so much about Black people?" he, she, or they would ask. And I would always answer, "Well, sir or ma'am, the first thing you must remember is I'm Black. The second is I'm keenly aware of what I write, and after counting the number of columns I have written specifically about Black people or issues of interest to Black people, I have determined that it's about 35% of all my columns. So 2 things are true. I need to write more about Black issues, and I need to write more about Black people. But," I typically continued, "here's my question. Why are you so bothered that I write about Black people?" The answers were as varied as the levels of prejudice. One said, "You can never move on if you keep pointing out differences." Another said, "You're too talented to do that." Still one said, "Just stop. Just stop." Apparently he had not given me permission. Why talk about slavery? Why talk about race? Why not move on? The answer is simple. There is no moving on when it is so hard for African Americans to move. The Civil War wasn't just between the states. It was between the past and the future, between Black and white. And the racial conflict in America, as long as it persists, will make it impossible to overcome the wealth gap between Black and white Americans. When America celebrated the 70th anniversary of Jackie Robinson's landmark act to desegregate modern Major League Baseball, his quote circulated on Twitter wasn't about his joy at joining a white team. It was this one from his 1972 autobiography, "I Never Had It Made." There I was, the Black grandson of a slave, the son of a Black sharecropper, part of an historic occasion, a symbolic hero to my people. The air was sparkling, the sunlight was warm, the band struck up the national anthem, the flag billowed in the wind. It should have been a glorious moment for me as the stirring words of the national anthem poured from the stands. Perhaps it was, but then again, perhaps the anthem could be called the theme song for a drama called The Noble Experiment. Today, as I look back on that opening game of my first World Series, I must tell you that it was Mr. Rickey's drama and that I was only a principal actor. As I write this 20 years later, I cannot stand and sing the anthem. I cannot salute the flag. I know that I am a Black man in a white world. In 1972, in 1947, at my birth in 1919, I know that I never had it made. African Americans have been moving targets, moving but not allowed to move too far for a century and a half, confronted with racism, sometimes beneath the surface, sometimes in our faces, but all the time, anytime, even when we least expect it. It was explained brilliantly in a scene from Shonda Rhimes' ABC television show, Grey's Anatomy, when Maggie, a Black doctor, tells a white colleague, Amelia, how it feels. Well, it's not an issue for you. It's not all of a sudden. I mean, okay, it's not Mississippi burning or anything, but it is all over. It's when people assume I'm a nurse, or when I go to get on an airplane with my first class ticket and they tell me they're not boarding coach yet. It's like a low buzz in the background. And sometimes you don't even notice it. And sometimes it's loud and annoying. And sometimes it can get dangerous. And sometimes it is ridiculous, like right now. African Americans have been seeking permission to seek joy, to build wealth since the official end of slavery. But the racists who have existed for centuries, who are tolerated, celebrated, and lately empowered, make it hard. Through the years, Black Americans have watched our culture appropriated and desegregation attempted on the backs of our children. We watch the federal government explicitly participate in housing segregation. The FHA subsidized builders creating subdivisions for whites with the requirement that none of the homes be sold to African Americans. Yeah, the federal government. The segregation of our metropolitan areas today leads to stagnant inequality because families are much less able to be upwardly mobile while living in a segregated neighborhood. Missing opportunity. If we want greater equality in this society, if we want a lowering of hostility between police and younger African American men, we need to take steps to actually desegregate. And if we want to erase or even lower the wealth gap, we have to understand how and why it persists. That is easier said than done in a culture which African Americans still are not treated equally by banks, and segregation remains easy to maintain. As recently as April 2017, a federal judge in a white suburb of Birmingham, Alabama, allowed a little predominantly Black Jefferson County School District to be separated because she said that racial motives assailed the dignity of Black school children. So she ruled that Gardendale, a white suburb, and their parents deserve local control over schools and shouldn't have to have Black kids attend, adding that she was concerned for the Black students who had been made to feel unwelcome. Right. My awareness of the low buzz and the level of anger I felt at my own lost history came in a conversation with my grandfather in 1988. I was a reporter at the Washington Post. I was visiting our family home in Tarboro, that little town I mentioned to you, and I had finally decided to ask my grandfather about his past. We grew up learning to not ask, learning to not push too far. My grandfather, Mr. Benny Pitt, and you had to call him all three names, Mr. Benny Pitt, was a man of few words, most of them gruff. But he was a good husband and father to his two daughters and his youngest daughter's three children, whom he and his wife, my grandmother, Lonnie Hilliard Pitt, raised. He was a frightening man to his grandchildren, my friends, and most of our neighbors, who all cowered a little in his presence. I often wondered whether his persona, built for years of gruffness, was a way to claim the power and respect he should have had just by being an African American man, but was denied because he was African. The stature he demanded was affirmed every day when I heard people address him on the street by his surname, but mostly by his full name. Morning, Mr. Pitt. Hey, Mr. Benny Pitt. It was affirmed further by his refusing to call people by their given names. He called every man and boy Charlie. Hey, Charlie, he'd shout to Mr. Davis across the street, whose first name was Alexander. And all of them, everyone would answer, hey, Mr. Benny Pitt. That sunny afternoon, as we sat on the porch of my growing up house and I asked him about my ancestors, I could sense his impatience with me. We traveled back generation by generation, from him to his father Nathaniel, to his grandfather Ad, to his great-grandfather Balaam. He always stopped at Balaam, either because that was as far as he knew, because that was as far as he dared to go. He gave me the name, but not the circumstances. He refused to talk much about growing up in the bend of the river, the Tar River in eastern North Carolina. But I was a reporter. I was undaunted. I drove an hour and a half to Raleigh, our state capital, to review census records and birth and death certificates and tax records. I found Balaam in death, but that whetted my appetite to know more. I wanted to find him in life. I finally did in the property tax records of an Edgecombe County lawyer named Pitt. I found the death certificate of his wife, Jane, but I could find no more. I resigned myself to knowing I'd never learn how tall she was, the color of her skin, or the size of her smile. Every discovery in my search for my family's history led to a heartache I can only explain by reminding people why it was such a big deal when Alex Haley searched for and found the roots of his own family tree in a village in Gambia, to know there was a beginning somewhere. My great-great-grandfather was not wealth I could leave to my grandchildren. This nation's race story is an economic story, always has been. Over the past half century, Black Americans have made substantial social and economic progress, gaining political rights that long had been denied, entering professions for which they had been blocked, and largely overcoming centuries of overt racism. While there were only 5 Black members of Congress when the Civil Rights Act became law in 1964, there currently are 56 Black members of Congress. Black activists, scholars, and social commentators have raised awareness about the importance of diversity and shaped the national conversation around race. And there's been a proliferation of Black writers, screenwriters, artists, poets, athletes, musicians who have become superstars. And the 21st century saw the election of the first African-American president, Barack Obama. Leading indicators of economic prosperity and other measures of well-being also have trended upward for most of this period. However, these very visible signs of improvement mask deep inequities that relegate tens of millions of Black Americans to second-class status. And the majority of Americans fail to recognize this, the magnitude of the problems. For example, a 2019 study found that over 97% of respondents vastly underestimated the huge gap. The median wealth held by Black families, 17,000. White families, 171,000, a ratio of 10 to 1. In 1978, Black households in the United States earned 59 cents for every dollar of income whites earned. In 2015, Black families still earn 59 cents for every dollar of income that white families receive. For every dollar of wealth that whites have, Black families have 6 pennies and Latinos have 7 pennies. And in 2019, the median Black household earned just 61 cents for every dollar of income. Just damn. So, African Americans as a people have been locked out of the country our ancestors built for centuries, but the death of George Floyd changed that. The world saw a Black man as a man, and it changed everything. Most important, it changed the narrative that Black life began in enslavement and that Black people have not been capable of being more than enslaved. It put to shame the false narrative about intellect and ability. Now everyone is hiring Black people, promoting Black people, talking to Black people about previously taboo subjects. I have become the Black Google for my friends. There's no better time in American history to talk about wealth and to talk about estates and to talk about generational wealth with Black people than now. Now the facts and figures that Black columnists and economists and politicians have been citing for decades are being heard for the first time. Now people see us. But which people do they see? Do they see just these facts, that we're twice as likely to live in poverty, that only 42% of us own our own homes, that the incarceration rate is 6 times the rate for white Americans, that Black children are 3 times as likely to live in poverty as white children, that white families accumulate more wealth over their lives than Black or Hispanic families do? None of these things are surprising, but are they the only things that you see? Or do you also see the amazing legacy of resilience and brilliance and achievement of people who started with nothing to get to where we are today? I put the question to you, dear members of the American College of Trust and Estate Counselors, a nonprofit association of lawyers and law professors skilled and experienced in the preparation of wills and trusts, and who I'd not heard of until Stephanie Perry called and said, I'd like you to come and talk about this. Consider these questions that we discuss further during the Q&A, and you should start putting your questions in the chat screen now. Do you individually or as a group, do you see us? Do you see African Americans now? Did George Floyd wake you up to the travesty of inequity, whether it's economic or social or political, the things that have become the very hallmark of America? Now think about the Black people in your world, if there are any, and Stephanie Perry has a poll for you to take to ask 3 more questions. What percentage of your law school graduating class was African American? That looks like 60%, under 5%. What percentage of the estates and trust attorneys in your firm, are African American? Okay, here we are. 86%, less than 5%. 1%, just 2 of you in the whole audience, 20% or more. We've got one last question, and this is one of the most important because it deals with what we're talking about today. What percentage of your estates and trust clients are African American? Well, I want to thank the 2 people in the audience who have 20% or more. So now let's deal with that last question about your clients, about the people that you work for, the people who need your expertise more than anything. You're talking about a lot of people who don't have many African American clients, and then you're talking about only two that have sort of a healthy balance, 20% or more. So the next question that I have for you is why? Or why not? Oh, and I forgot to mention something. The well-documented and persistent racial wealth gap. Wait, let me go back a minute. I want you to think about that again. Why not? Let me make sure I have the chat screen open because I want to see if you're already starting to answer that question. There we are. Now we have some questions coming in. I just want to make sure those questions are coming in. But the well-documented and persistent racial wealth gap is itself great cause for concern, but it also leads to concern about the implications for broader participation in charitable giving. I am a firm believer in philanthropy. And here's something you need to know. Black people are philanthropists. Yes, though hindered by a history of structural barriers and practices that have blocked asset building and wealth creation, we choose to prioritize philanthropy. Of all racial or ethnic groups in the data set, Black families have contributed the largest proportion of their wealth, which can include savings, used cars, land, investment accounts, tithes to churches, the largest to charity since 2010. Black people tend to give, but we give differently, and the wealth management industry has not cared to learn the ways we give. Those are the words of Tamara Winfrey Harris. She's vice president of community leadership and effective philanthropy at Central Indiana Community Foundation. What she said is very likely they know where white people with money hang out. They don't know where Black people with money hang out. It's not necessarily at the same clubs. So the very people who might have important information to pass along aren't any more available to people who need your advice and guidance than the clients you have now. So we've covered three things today. You cannot bequeath what you do not have, so there hasn't been a lot of generational wealth to pass down. Black Americans are mistrustful of systems that have been discriminatory, and that should not be surprising to us because sometimes they're deadly. And Black Americans, more than white and Latinx Americans, give a greater portion of their salary and their goods to charity while they're living. So if we want to close the wealth gap and create a greater pool of clients for managing estates and finances after death, we must assume that while not every Black American has the once and twice in a lifetime chance to become an Oprah Winfrey or a Bill Gates, it does not mean that they are doing right by handling their estates. Just look at Aretha Franklin. Should you be vigorously recruiting Black clients, explaining the value of financial management and a will? I sure hope so, because Aretha Franklin could have used you. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. Now what I'd love to do is to entertain a few questions, clarify any points, and get a recommendation for a good financial advisor. So let's take a look at some of the questions in the chat, and we'll have a great conversation. I'm going to go to the top to see if I've missed some because there are lots of good people in here. Oh, wow. Oh, here we are. Okay, so what would it take, asked Julie Grove, to motivate an African American to join our white team, even if motivation is not just to have a token person of color on the team? Now, I want to make sure I'm getting Julie's question right. Are you talking about an African American becoming your colleague or an African American becoming a team of clients? If you're talking about somebody who you want to work with, the first thing you want to do is make sure that it's a place where they would want to work. I have worked in newsrooms that have been horrible for Black people. I wanted to be a journalist so much that I did not care. That's not true for everybody. So you have to make clear that wherever you are, it's welcoming for people, whoever they are, and that it's about the talent that they bring to the table and the things that they can do. And I do want to suggest, I hope you're hearing me, Julie, you don't have to try too hard. I don't think that there's this sense that you have to do the Black Google or learn Black history overnight so that you can have something to talk to somebody about. I think what you'll find is if you treat people like people, you'll find those things that you have in common that have nothing to do with race. So That's one thing to consider. And then from Carol Kleiman, how do we reach clients who believe that estate planning is for everyone, not just wealthy individuals? That's a really good question, because I think part of the problem is people assume, and this is lots of people, this is not just Black people, but it's people who usually don't have a lot of money. They think they don't have an estate. And what people need to understand is your estate is whatever it is that you're leaving. And if you spend some time trying to make sure that that's sort of a nice nest egg, it makes it better. But even if you don't, if you're leaving something, you want to make sure that it's left the right way. So I would have conversations with people, workshops, panel discussions, maybe even stopping in a few Black churches to talk about what an estate actually is. Lisa Monahan says, Black people do not call me. I wish they would. Lisa, you need to call them. Start again with some of the Black ministers. Start with some of the Black attorneys in your town, because they make money. And if they are not estate planning, they should, but they can also help guide you to some of the people who they know have money, but are not necessarily thinking about what to do with it after they die. Rohan says, I have a meeting with a Black lawyer tomorrow whom I'm considering bringing into my firm. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And thanks for sharing it, because that's important for people to know that you're trying to literally put words into action. Tracy says, Tracy Potts, there haven't been as many opportunities in the Black community to speak about estate planning. I certainly think it is a valid issue and should be a place where we are doing further outreach. When opportunities don't exist, Tracy, make them. Again, call up 100 Black men or the Black sororities and say, I'd like to come to a session and talk about this with the people in your group, because they have money. You do not want this to be a problem after they're gone. And I can tell you there are a lot of fights that happen in a lot of Black families, and it's not about China or silverware. So if you don't have an opportunity, make one. From Lauren Wolven, historically, we have trouble recruiting law students of color to trust and estates. We are going into the law schools at Chicago to discuss the practice and to recruit. Any tips on how we can be more effective? Make it about the money. Make it about the fact that you are going to help join them to you to change people's lives. Not only do you want to make sure that people are generating wealth, but you want to make sure that they don't have to worry about anything as they're getting near the end of their time. That's the last time that you want to think about fighting or who's going to get what. Do all of that stuff. Let somebody do it for you. But again, I think the biggest thing is, if you go in and you're talking about death, that's just not a conversation that a lot of Black people want to have. And I know that may sound stereotypical, but sometimes stereotypes are true. Black people want to talk about the funeral and the repast and how to make sure all of that happens. But money and death at the same time, it doesn't happen often enough. I never had a conversation with my grandparents who raised me about a will or about what to do after they were gone. Never. Didn't have that conversation with my mother. I don't know any of my friends who have had that conversation with their parents, and they're all going through probate and all types of, very troubling and heartbreaking stuff while they're also grieving. That's another thing that you can do. Let them know that it's going to make it easier for those folks who need to focus on grieving and having time to think about them in an emotional way instead of a financial way. Are you looking for questions or an answer as to why I think my clients are less than 10% Black? Yes, I would love for you to say that. So please, George Gregory, put that in the chat. The reason I even have African Americans, and this is from Janelle Smith, comprise 10 to 20% of my practice is because of my personal contacts and referrals. Without my sphere, my client base would likely have even less representation. Thank you, Janelle, for mentioning that, because that is one of the most important points ever. Years ago, there was this amazing joke that would always happen if somebody would talk about whether somebody was racist or not, and they'd go, oh no, my best friend is Black. And it came from an old Sammy Davis Jr. joke. But if you don't know any Black people, you're not going to get any Black clients. If you don't know any Black people, you're not going to be able to recruit Black colleagues. It is about your personal sphere and how diverse you make your life or make your work life. You don't want to hang around Black people after work, that's fine. But if you want to diversify what you're doing and reach out to more people, then you need to diversify your work life. So that personal sphere is a very important point. And thank you, Janelle, for mentioning that. Let's see, we're going down to Scott Squillis, I think it is. That's a great name. What would be your hypothesis why Aretha Franklin and other stars like her are not doing proper estate planning? I suspect they have managers and advisors. They have lots of managers, they have agents and managers for the people around them. But what they don't have is this history of having to deal with what to do after life is over. Everything that many Black Americans, and I can say this with some certainty, are taught about wealth is about having things while you're living. You're talking about a people who went from having nothing, absolutely nothing, to all of a sudden being able to be a little successful, and in some cases being very successful. Well, they want to showcase that. Nice house, nice cars, great clothes. That is becoming a little bit of a stereotype too. People talk about, oh, you've got all of this stuff, but do you have a college saving for your kids, or what are you doing? But it's about being able to feel for the first time like you belong. And Aretha Franklin was from that generation that was true. She owned several houses. She owned lots of mink coats, including that one that she threw off at the Kennedy Center honors when she sang to one of my favorite singers, Carole King. But it's just not ingrained. It's something that you want to help teach. It's something you want to help reach out to people to talk about. George Gregory again, do you think that education and attitudes about savings are a major part of the problem? It is the problem. If you have children who are growing up in poverty, their parents are not teaching them about savings because there is nothing to save. They're paying the rent, they're paying the childcare, they're getting food on the table. There's usually nothing left. So they're not thinking about savings. They're certainly not thinking about what they can save for another generation. So if you start to literally do that now, I can remember my grandmother talking to us about not savings like in a bank or when we were grown up, but as kids. She kept a jar of dimes at the front door and we were not allowed to touch it. And she explained that was for the kids at the school where she would sometimes be a substitute teacher when they didn't have lunch money. They knew they could stop and get money from her for that. That's about that philanthropy and giving that we talk about all the time, that Black people as a community, not all Black people, but Black people do. But if you start early talking about wealth building and talking about savings, even with my grandson, I used to make up ways for him to make money. When he would come to visit, I'd say, we need to go out and pull all of the weeds and you can have a quarter for each one. Oh my God, you've never seen such hard work. He was pulling I had to keep him away from the flowers, but he would earn a bunch of money, which he called shiny coins, and he put them all in his jar and he would not spend them. He said, no, I'm going to save that till I want to know what I want to do with it. It can start early. Tracy Potts says, I used to recruit for my law firm and I found that lots of Black law students weren't interested in trusts and estates. Maybe it's because they had little experience with our field in their family history. What do you think? I think that's absolutely true, but I also think that just like I wanted to be a journalist, partly because I had no math skills and partly because I really wanted to find a way to be a writer, make it about the money. Make it about changing people's lives, making it about doing something that everybody can't do, but everybody should have someone to help them with. And, talk to them about what you like about it. And make sure that you've always got a story of something that went well. Or you can tell them the story of Aretha Franklin and how, quite frankly, if there were more people of color who were doing what you do, there would be less distrust and maybe more people would have estates. I mentioned Prince and Aretha Franklin and James Brown, but there are dozens of people, not just entertainers, but people with money who have not done that. Carol says this is an issue that the Massachusetts Bar Association is focusing on. We need you. I'm glad to come. Brian Sparks says the Black proportion of the population has been declining while the Hispanic proportion has been increasing. Do you expect that trend to continue? And if so, what do you think the implications of that are? It's purposefully a broad question. Actually, I would challenge that, Brian. We just finished a census where here in Detroit, our census participation was so low, we have no idea how many people we have. But there are two things that the census did that were very troubling to me. One is giving Hispanic Americans the ability to declare themselves as white, and the other to continually make Black people afraid of filling out forms. They're so afraid that somebody's going to take something or somebody's going to do something. If you have somebody who's getting assistance from the state and somebody shows up with a form asking you to, fill out forms and answer questions, and you're worried that, oh no, this is a secret plot that I won't be able to feed my children, they don't do it, which means we don't really know that it's decreasing. But what we do know is, regardless of how the census takes the forms, we are seeing, and we were seeing that trend for a long time, that the minority in this country would soon be the majority. And of course, if you talk to the conspiracy theorists, they'll say that there is a plot to make sure that that never happens. But I think that regardless of what happens, we still have to make sure that however many African Americans, Hispanics, Latino, that we talk to all of our people of every color about taking care of your wealth while you're living, but also taking care of your wealth for your family's sake while you're gone. Oh, and back to the question about how to convince people to do it. You are really helping families. If people don't want to think about their own death and they don't want to think about giving money, then what you can do is say, okay, let's talk about what you want to do for your family. It's the same reason people buy life insurance, and not enough Black people do that. But they see life insurance, it's like, okay, that's going to give some money for the funeral. It's not just going to do that, but estate planning does the same thing. Thank you so much to the team for those asking about my book. If you go to RochelleRiley.com, you'll see information about the new book and how to buy The Burden, which just came out in paperback. Mickey Davis, we need to do a better job explaining to law students the importance of the trust and estate field. Black law students are heavily recruited by litigation and commercial practices, which can offer lucrative careers. Now, that's a good point that I don't know how to get around, Mickey, because everybody's going to go after the bigger job. We have a problem in the medical profession now where more people want to be surgeons, particularly plastic surgeons. So you don't have enough medical students who want to be internists and primary care physicians, which we desperately need. That's just like the number of teachers that are going to be retiring. We write about it. As a journalist, I wrote about it. We know it's coming, but nobody's doing anything about it. We don't have enough students who want to study education and be teachers. What's going to happen to our public schools? So I think that the better job has to come peer to peer instead of somebody trying to recruit somebody to come and do something. You're going to have to make sure people understand why you do it, because what you guys do is so important. Let's see, Ruth Matson, thank you for this great present. Oh, thank you. I have tended to let my practice grow organically and didn't think about how that perpetuated discrimination. Thank you for the practical tips to actively serve communities of color. You are quite welcome. And I want to remind you all again, I can never stress enough how important it is to occasionally visit a Black church. First of all, great singing. Second of all, great prayers. There's probably always going to be food after, but you get to know people that you otherwise never would meet. And it shows that you care. It shows that whoever you are, it meant something for you to come, to some place that was not necessarily in your comfort zone to do that. That's something I would do. The other thing is Black-owned restaurants. You find a good barbecue joint. I don't know whoever might be here from Kansas City, but just go someplace different sometimes. Meet some people that are different. Expand your periphery and your world. George is back. Lawyers work by referral. I also have some clients for other things. About 50% do estate planning. My Black clients only have about 25% are interested. We've got work to do, George, but the biggest thing, again, is to make sure people understand that you're doing it for more than you. You're doing it for your family. You're doing it to change the trajectory and change the narrative of what happens with Black people. We haven't had a lot of wealth to build. We haven't had a lot of wealth to leave. But if we start to really remind people that every person has an estate and get people used to the idea that I have an estate, I want to make sure I leave that estate to someone. It doesn't have to be millions of dollars. Janelle is back with a question. Oh, no, with a statement. I am an attorney and registered investment advisor with 12 years experience, and I'm striving to reach more Black individuals because cohesion between estate planning and financial planning is critical. Truer words could not be said. The trust factor is huge, and I hope my colleagues with firms with few Black attorneys change that, as well as have Black financial advisors on the list of outside professionals to whom you refer your clients. That's a really good point, too. Make sure that you are using Black professionals for other things, because those will be some of the people who will be able to connect you again with folks who might not necessarily be estate planning now, but could be convinced to do it if the right person sent you. Stephen Schindler, thank you for this vital message. The New York Times recently reported on a study finding that appraisers will place lower values on homes with photos of families than comparable homes with photos of Black families, with photos of homes of white families. This affects access to home equity loans. Appraisers, however, may say their work merely reflects the prejudices within the private home market. How do we as professionals address manifestations of systemic racism like this? I'll tell you the same thing that I say in every presentation: do not tolerate it. I say that as a hypocrite because I've bought and sold 5 houses, and I took down the family photos and some of the Black art in each of them because I wanted a lot of money. I would never do that again. I also, when I bought my last house in Ann Arbor, Michigan, they apologized at the closing because the deed still had the deed restriction in it that the house couldn't be sold to a Black person. And they said, "Oh, we're sorry, we're going to have this redone." I said, "No, you're not. I want that document just like it is. I'm going to frame that and keep that because you don't know how important it is to me that that's no longer true." So we all have to just not tolerate hate, not tolerate racism, not tolerate the things that you see, and not work with people who do. From Terrence Franklin: the posting of your talk on the ACTEC podcast series will be a useful tool for our attorneys to encourage Black people to consider the importance of estate planning. Are there other strategies you could suggest? Yes, I think that I should go and talk to every estate planning firm in the country. No, I'm teasing. But I do think that there are workshops that you can do and partner with different estate firms that are really interested in doing this. If you're serious, and if some of your colleagues are serious, get 5 or 10 together to do a workshop where you invite people who need to hear it. And there are plenty of people who will talk about it. But again, I'm happy to do it. I think that one of the things that we have to pay attention to is how we address people that we're not used to talking to. I think that talking to people as equals, talking to people that you're seeing as worthy of having a conversation about what they're leaving behind when they go, these are not easy conversations, but I think that you can find a way to make people feel important about doing it. Marcia Fujimoto asks, are you able to give us more information about Black philanthropy? I will make sure that Stephanie sends you some of the sites that I researched to talk about this. I have known that was true for some time, and Black people in my circles talk about it all the time because we all give money. As a matter of fact, too much. I'm constantly, supporting the causes that are important to me, and I don't necessarily think about it as taking away from my estate. But as I get older, I tend to write checks that are not as large because I do want to make sure that my grandson has a huge amount of money in case he's not a really big professional football player, which I don't want him to be anyway. From Charles Nash: did you know Lee Jaggs? Oh, I don't. Is it guitar or guitar? He's talking about somebody who worked at one of the newspapers years ago. Somebody just mentioned his name a few weeks ago, but I did not know him. I came to Detroit. My first day was 9/11 of 2000, which is why I've never celebrated an anniversary, because a year later the world shifted. So I don't know a lot of the older folks, but I bet you I can find out. Laura Walker Plunkett: I represent a handful of African-American athletes. Many of their managers don't see estate planning as a priority, creating another roadblock. Once we educate and get a manager on board, things go much better. All it takes is one. If you can find one of your athletes and convince them that what happened to at least 6 different athletes in the past year could happen to them, and all of a sudden they're gone and nobody's going to know what to do about their kids, their families, and they don't want to leave that behind. Come up with a motto: leave no mess behind, and see if you can't get one client. And once you do that, and that client starts talking to people about how, yeah, man, I got my stuff straight, so now I don't have to worry about it. That's the, it's the one person at a time plan, but it can work if you get the right person who's willing to do it and willing to say they did it. Oh, no, she sent this from Nancy Welber: can you discuss the wall near 8 Mile and Myers built in the 1950s? She will know what I'm talking about. I actually want to call it up. Since we've got till 5, hold on one second. Let me just go to, there is a wall in Detroit that was built to separate a Black neighborhood from a white neighborhood. It's now a really big deal memorial, but I would rather you go to Google and find that for yourself, because what I don't want is to give you the wrong information. But I can tell you that when people say 8 Mile, they think of the 8 Mile, which is miles and miles long, that separates Detroit from all of Oakland County and beyond. But there's another wall that literally was there to separate Black people from white people. And it's the kind of thing that you would think would only happen in the South, but it happened in Detroit because this region for years has been pegged as one of the most racist in the country. And when I first got here 20 years ago, I absolutely believed it. Things are getting better, and Detroit is becoming much more diverse. And there's so much that's happening now that is exciting. I moved to Detroit again in 2000 to stay for 2 years on my way to Los Angeles to make movies. And of course, 20 years later, I'm still here because I love this city. But there are serious racial problems, and that wall is one of them. Karen Yates, I specialize in planning for really wealthy families and meet most clients as referrals from other clients. While there are Black folks among my friends and family, none are as wealthy as my poorest clients. I'm not either. I'm not sure how to find and approach Black multimillionaires, or if that's even a worthy goal. It's absolutely a worthy goal. And, you know, quite frankly, I don't know if you've asked any of your clients who their Black friends are. Everybody has at least one. And there are Black multimillionaires. I don't know whether any of them have not done estate planning already, because it's kind of a different, you know, atmosphere, different group of people. But I would start with that and just say, you know what, I really want to be more diverse in the work that I'm doing. Do you have someone that you think I should talk to? And if all else fails, go after entertainers, because some of these folks are making boatloads of money with sort of a thimble of talent. But that's okay, because I have no problem with people making money. Ruth is back. Great financial advice. Thank you so much. There's another one. Mark. Oops, went too fast. Carrie Brown shares that there's an app, Official Black Wall Street, that lists over 5,500 Black-owned businesses worldwide, including a lot of restaurants. Yes, and that is another thing that you can do. Like I said, find the clubs, find the restaurants, find the churches, go visit. Make yourself, you know, available. Introduce yourself to people. Let them know what you do. Sometimes people will just ask because they're interested, but you never know. You might walk into somebody who, you know, there are so many people who keep their wealth a secret because they don't want people to know. They're the millionaire in the room. I have a friend who I literally just found out owns 5 houses and has been saving money for years. And I went, oh my God, you're the millionaire next door. And he went, yeah, I guess I am. I have no idea whether he's done any estate planning, but you know what? I'm going to ask him as soon as we get off this call. Lisa Moynihan says, as a community service, I frequently talk to community groups, including churches, about the basics of estate planning and why it is important. Would it be presumptuous of me to call Black ministers and invite myself to do this for their congregations? Absolutely not presumptuous. As a matter of fact, some of them would appreciate it. And again, Black ministers also make good money. The mega ministers, not all of them. But keep doing that, encouraging other people to do that. That is a great plan, Lisa. From Ann Burns, in Minneapolis, a group of attorneys is doing pro bono work to remove restricted covenants on all houses. Thank you and amen, because they do still exist. Carol Kleiman is back. We want change to come so fast, but is it going to take generations to overcome systemic racism that exists in our legal institutions, including tax, trust, and estate laws? That's the most depressing thing that we've talked about today, Carol. It has been generations. And I think that it's going to come a lot faster, partly because of George Floyd, and partly because there is a movement around the globe for people to finally want us to be our better selves. So I don't think it's going to take another 5 or 6 generations, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. George says, I've spoken to Black sorority alumni associations. They were interested, had good questions, seems to be outside of your mold. Outside of your mold. I don't know what that means. Oh, you mean like Black sorority alumni instead of Black sororities. When I say Black sororities, I mean all of them. I'm in an alumni association because I pledged in college. So not just Black alumni for sororities, but Black alumni, period. You know, the Howard University Alumni Association has some of the most well-known people, some of them who are wealthy, not wealthy like, I forgot her name, who has all the multimillionaires, but who have a decent amount of money and who probably be interested. Tracy Potts said, I just sent an email to our local Black Attorney Bar Association and asked them to come and speak about estate planning and the lack of outreach. I encourage all of you to do the same. Y'all listen to Tracy, that's a good idea. Ann Burns says, your artwork is gorgeous. Who are the artists? These are all Detroit artists. The ones on the left that they're sort of fabulous mural-like, are done by a guy named Sheafy McFly, who's from Detroit and now splits his time between Detroit. And even though the team told me to keep this down, I'm going to just raise this just a little so you can see it. This one over here is by an artist named Lawrence Gary. When I left the Free Press, I never heard of him. I didn't know him, but he came to the newspaper with his sons and his wife, and they presented that to me for my service as a columnist for almost 20 years. It moved me to tears. The video is on YouTube. If you look up Rochelle Riley and Lawrence Gary, that just showed up and said, we'd like to come and bring you something. And that's the photo, that's the painting. Thank you for asking about it. From an anonymous attendee, okay, so I will not mention any names. Black clients with modern families often do appreciate the necessity of planning and often know the issues and questions they want to address. In my experience, appreciate that it isn't all about tax or wealth accumulation, but supporting and recognizing your blended or modern family. That is another good point, because we really do have all types of situations, family situations, two nuclear families, stepdaughters, stepsons, half sisters. One of the things that you do, which is why the Aretha Franklin story has been so heartbreaking, is that you don't leave your family in disarray. That, you know, they're in court fighting with each other. This will probably wreck relationships for a generation. And that's just something else that you can talk to people about. Make sure that your intent is clear. Let's see, another recommendation for a CPA. And here's from Sarah Johnson. One of the interesting things in our field is the intestate laws, which were written for white nuclear families with mom, dad, and 2 kids. Your family is an example of what I see in Black families, grandparents as parents, cousins as siblings. It seems as we leaders in our fields, we may want to revisit those. Somebody could pronounce that for me, but intestate, dying without a will, intestacy laws. That's a part of that whole ideal where America was built on white wealth and white tradition, and Black people have been trying to break through with differences. And it's not just Black people. You know, you've got gay people who have situations they have to deal with. It's not just, we've moved past you not being able to see your partner in a hospital, but, you know, trying to leave your partner, you know, very clear instructions for what you want and to leave them their estate. All of those laws should be revisited. And that's a really good point. From Rhonda, there are 47 messages in here. I better go faster. From Rhonda Brink, one of the best conversations I ever had was with a Black professor who became my client many years ago. 40 minutes, our first meeting, telling me what a hard time his family had financially. Now he was the first generation in his family to go to college and how discrimination affected him in the workplace. I stopped him to tell him that his story was my story. I was a 40-year-old white female. We need to find similarities. If we did more of that, we would see that we have more in common than we have not in common. Nancy Welber says, we miss your columns, Rochelle. Thank you. I have never missed them more than this past month. I mean that. But you can follow me on Twitter at Rochelle Riley. My feed is kind of fierce, so be careful. From Debbie Cox, home ownership is the greatest source of generational wealth. What needs to be done in the banking world to encourage home ownership among minority families? Not make it so hard to get a mortgage. It is still hard to get a mortgage. We are still asked the question. I am a single mom. I adopted my daughter when she was 2. It was always just the 2 of us. She's grown now and married and living in Dallas. When I'm asked information about my husband, or if they ask whether you're married or single, and this is on everything from credit cards to buying something at Best Buy, I refuse to answer those questions. I don't say whether I'm single or married. I don't answer questions about husbands, but they're still asked. So that would be the most important thing. Thank you so much, team, for putting my Twitter in there. Let me go down to, oh, we're catching up. That's good. Let's go back to over here to the Q&A and see. At John Lewis's funeral, this is from Terrence Franklin, and Barack Obama said that Lewis's mother told him what was in his head nobody could take from him. I wonder if there's something about the experience of knowing history of whites taking property from blacks, Tulsa, Wilmington, Jim Crow, lynching, that we focus more on giving to the current generation things that can't be taken away, education, for example. By the way, I was the first Black female in the College of 2001 since 1949, quadrupled now, a lot of work to do. Wow. Wow. Well, I can tell you that that is something to remind people of. When people talk about Black Wall Street and talk about all of those things that they act like we're totally in the past and can't happen again, you have to remind them that they happened the first time. I lived in Louisville, Kentucky, where there was a whole Black business district before I got there that people still talked about. It was Walnut Street. They changed it to Muhammad Ali Boulevard, closed down all the businesses, Black insurance companies, Black banks. And so now people don't think that's possible, but I still think those things are possible. You just have to find people who are willing to do it. Can you give the name of your book again? Yes, I absolutely will. It's called The Burden, African Americans and the Enduring Impact of Slavery. It just came out in paperback. If you go to RochelleRiley.com, it tells you how you can buy it. My next book I'm very excited about is called That They Lived, African Americans Who Changed the World. I'm going to show you the cover really quickly because I'm so proud of it. About 2 years ago, there was a woman on Twitter and Facebook who literally posted pictures of her 4-year-old daughter dressed as famous African Americans. And it was stunning. And I thought, oh my God, I have to know who this woman is. I think we should do something with this. I'm looking for the cover of the book. And so I decided, I think I'm going to go out and talk to her and see if we can write some, no, that's not it. Hold on. If I can write some biographies actually some biographical essays to go with those photos. And she agreed. And we worked for the past year on this book. Oh, I know where it is. And I flew out with my grandson. And thanks to Fortnite, we were able to convince him. Oh, let me see if I can move this over. There we are. That's the cover. We convinced him in between bouts of Fortnite and her daughter Lola to allow her to dress them as famous African Americans. Here's W.E.B. Du Bois, Thurgood Marshall, and that's Rosa Parks. This book comes out in February 2nd. And I'm very proud of that because I want to make sure that young children of all colors know that every important person who ever lived was once a child. And each of the essays starts with what these famous people were doing as children. So thanks for asking about The Burden. And you can also find out about That They Lived at RochelleRiley.com. From Stephanie T. Perry. Oh, Stephanie, hey. What I particularly appreciate about the perspective of this discussion is that it provides an alternate narrative to the meritocracy narrative that we often hear. That narrative completely ignores that the playing field simply is not level, and that is not by chance. It is by design, and we have to dismantle that design. That is absolutely right. The only way to change things is to decide they need to be changed, and that's something every individual has to do. When is The Burden coming out in audiobook? It is available in audiobook. If you go to Wayne State University Press, which is one of the buttons on RochelleRiley.com, it'll take you to that page where you can get it audio. I listened to an audiobook just once, Tayari Jones' marriage book, because I had to drive someplace for 5 hours. It was great. It was interesting, but I kept wanting to pull over and read. I'm a very tactile. I need to have a book, but you can get the audiobook. Oh, it looks like we're at the end. Let me go back over to the Q&A and see, has anyone told you how many Black ACTEC fellows there are? It is embarrassing. 2,500 members, and I think there are 4 Black members. Is that right, Stephanie? Oh, let me go back over here.
That's right, Rochelle.
Thank you. Yes, that is embarrassing for any industry, for any entity. But the fact that you want to do better and the fact that you had me come and talk to you today means that there are people who want to change it. And I thank you for that. From Margaret Roisman, California Prop 13 in 1975 and Prop 78 a few years later perpetuated the systemic racism of redlining in the property tax laws by giving children of landed white families and established white businesses a tax break into the future indefinitely. Oh, this is a political announcement. Okay. Well, you guys read that political announcement, and I hope that you get what you want, Margaret. George Gregory says, one can use intestacy, thank you, intestacy to motivate people to do planning. Yes, I think that every story that you can tell somebody about what happens when you don't do it will help guide people towards the fact that they may want to do it. And I think we've gotten to, oh no, here's one more. One of this year's MacArthur Genius Grants went to Thomas Wilson Mitchell, who was the principal drafter of the Uniform Law and Partition of Heirs Property Act to reform laws that deprive Black and other disadvantaged Americans of their property and wealth. Glad to hear it. I knew a couple of the MacArthur geniuses, but I do not know Thomas Wilson Mitchell, so I'm going to make note of that and look him up. Everything that's ever changed, everything that's ever been done is because somebody decided that they were going to lead the charge, that they were going to make it happen. I think anybody on this call, I think there may be 200 people here in this space. If one of you decided, okay, I'm going to be one of the people who's going to make sure this changes, you can do it. I mean, I used to literally talk about Nancy Brinker all the time. She did something in honor of her sister who died of breast cancer that became Race for the Cure. One person, millions and millions of dollars in breast cancer research. So don't give up. Don't think that it's bigger than what we can change. We can fix this. I think that might have been the last question. Okay, so I want to ask one question of you now that we're at the end, and you can just think about it or you can answer in the chat. What are you going to do tomorrow that's different based on anything I said today? Just you, not your firm, not your family, but is there something that it can be just a change of thought, it can be an action, but whatever it is there's something that changed you and you want to do something different, let me know. Oh, thank you, Carol. So I'll remind you as you're thinking about that, visit a Black church, get to know Black sororities and fraternity members because a lot of them are distinguished and accomplished, which is why they're in fraternities and sororities. Go to Black-owned restaurants, have a great meal, and talk to the owner of a restaurant. Say, how are you doing? Have you talk to anybody about financial stuff? And if they don't think you're with the IRS, they might just listen. Here we go. Oh, thank you for jumping right in, folks. Let's take a look. I love the idea of attending a Black church. Thank you for a wonderful dialogue. Thank you so much, Ann Burns. In The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Race for Wealth Gap, Mesra argues that we can't create a Black Wall Street. Do you disagree? I absolutely disagree. I think that there are people who think that by just wanting to do that you're trying to perpetuate segregated wealth or segregated areas, but I don't think that there's anything wrong with a space where Black businesses can thrive. And it's not that it's just for Black people. It's just that people who are like-minded or who want to try and do something like that should be able to do it without somebody saying it's racist. I'm going to reach out to local Black churches and our Magic City Bar Association to make presentations. That's from Cynthia Lamar Hart. Thank you. Let's see, went too fast. Jim Spratt, Billings, Montana ACTEC fellow David Diedrich chaired the ABA RPTE Property Preservation Task Force, from which the Uniform Heirs Property Partition Act came. Okay, Mickey Davis is going to, this is really good. Mickey's going to contact a professor at the local historically Black law school about promoting the trust and estate practice. Every now and again, a professor needs a break. Find a professor at the law school who would love to have you come and speak so they get a break, and go and just talk a little bit. And again, talk about helping families, trying to make sure that there's no Aretha Franklin situation. Susan Gary is going to ask my law school, University of Oregon, to present this video with me to present to answer questions. Brilliant idea. Let people, be present, be there to answer questions. Alexa Philissant is going to be intentional about getting her own will completed. I'm also planning on inviting an estate planning attorney to a parenting group that I host so we can start with younger parents planning early for their future generations. That is brilliant. That's a really good idea. And there are Black mom groups and Black dad groups like that. Oh gosh, what's the name of them? I'll send something to Stephanie. It's like Brown Babies. No, what, Stephanie, do you know that group, Brown Moms or something? But there are groups. So that's a really good suggestion, Alexa. Celeste Muir, the person who was elected without opposition to succeed me as a circuit judge, is probably the first African-American female to accomplish that. When I joined the court, there were only a handful of women. Now our chief judge and a majority of elected trial judges in Miami-Dade are female. So very happy to see this, and this could be a trend. And they could also be clients. Do not miss out on the judges. Nancy Welber said, I'm going to contact a social justice group that I belong to and volunteer to speak about estate planning at a Black church. Great suggestion, Nancy. Tracy Potts, when I was a child, my mother told me that anyone can change the world. I believe it to this day. Throughout my life, I have believed in providing impact one person at a time. Let's all try to impact one more Black family at a time and make a difference. That's probably the most important thing that I wish I'd said today, that I thank you for saying. Even if just 200 people, if each of you just got one Black client, that's 200 more Black families who are going to be saved the trauma of not having a plan. That's huge. That's huge. Thank you, Tracy. And from Rhonda Brink, do you think that implicit bias showed its ugly head when you mentioned Black-owned restaurant and barbecue in the same breath? Not to be critical, but honest. Implicit bias, I don't get that. I like barbecue restaurants. The barbecue restaurants that I go to in Kansas City are owned by Black people. Gates Barbecue is some of the best in the country. So no, if you've got a white barbecue restaurant that you want to suggest, Rhonda, please put it in the chat or send me a note. You can get my email at Rochelle Riley, or you can find me on Twitter. It wasn't biased so much as I like good food, and I was talking about good food that I know. But thank you for the question. Lilith, I love that name. Bailey, what do you think about the affordability of estate planning? I have no idea how much it costs. I literally do not. It's the one question I didn't ask Stephanie before this presentation, because I think it's important enough that if it's a percentage of what you've got, or if it's something that can be put on a payment plan, it's still important. But somebody let me know if it's really prohibitive, and that's one of the problems. But there it is, Brown Mom. God, you are on it. The team is great. Dyla and Chris, brownmamas.com. There are several groups like that. If you just Google Black Mothers Groups, a bunch of them. Jack and Jill is another one. Thanks, Holly Norville, for that. Patricia Friedman, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I'm on the board of a private school in Atlanta that was blindsided by the Black at Instagram movement. The board has spent the summer learning about and accepting our inherent bias and our blind spots. I'm going to continue this growth by attending the NAIS People of Color conferences. Oh, this is, as a journalist, I was a member of the National Association of Black Journalists forever. Seek to have them do a presentation on estate planning. Not only do reporters need to write more about it so people understand it better, but there are some wealthy Black journalists, because they're anchors, who could use your help. Carol Kleiman, I'm going to work with the MBA to work on outreach to African American affinity groups. As someone who grew up in an ethnic community, I totally agree that a Black Wall Street will raise up the community. We had our schools, banks, lawyers, doctors that we trusted, and we together created a strong middle class. That's why I agree that it's possible. Thank you, Carol. Sandy, as a Black attorney, I regularly team up with my fellow Black attorneys to do programs in the community to educate the community on trust and estates issues and the importance of getting our documents in order. Black people want to learn more information on this realm. Plan it, they will participate. Never assume that people are going to be bored unless they've proven it to you. Try the workshops, try to set up some things, try to set up some one-on-ones. From Terry Franklin, I'm going to push to support and expand a recent ACTEC, is it ACTEC, can I say, or do I need to say ACTEC, foundation grant that hires a new law graduate to get training in trust and estates and provide legal services to help Black people hold onto their homes in Portland. Excellent, excellent suggestion. I want to thank you so much for the great questions and for listening, and just for paying attention. Please get a copy of the paper. Oops, I hit the computer. A paperback edition of The Burden. You can get it. Go to RochelleRiley.com. It'll tell you how. And you can be in touch with me if you want me to come and have a conversation. If you want me to talk to people. Like I said, I was teasing about going to every single estate planning firm in the country, but I might do 10 or 20. So thank you again so much to ACTEC. Thank you to Stephanie Perry for having me. Thank you to this amazing team that met beforehand to make sure that this would work. I didn't screw it up too much with Zoom. And thank you for all the thank yous that I'm getting now, Lisa and Sandra and Sandy. And this was great. I appreciate the welcome.
Thank you, Rochelle, for being with us. This has just been an excellent presentation. If we were doing it in person, I would be standing up and applauding. Again, thank you for being here. I really feel the perspective that you bring around these issues is so relevant right now. This is at the forefront of our minds and our discussions, and we could probably talk about this for another hour and a half. I know we have to end though. So again, thank you for being with us. Thank you for just a really terrific presentation. For anyone who is interested in continuing the conversation, as Rochelle said, her book is available. I highly recommend it. And finally, just thank you to the college for recognizing the importance of this discussion and giving us a forum to make it happen. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Rochelle, for your time today. We really appreciate the discussion.
I'm honored to do it. Thank you so much.